And I'm sure Becky's right. I'm sure that God's Spirit is doing something very particular amongst us this morning. And I pray that he continues to do that as we explore his claim, Jesus' claim, that I am the light of the world, and how he speaks into and reaches into our darkness. So I'm going to give some context. I'm going to start the talk before Ellen comes to read John chapter 9. Now it was dark. It was raining. I was picking up pace on my bike as I headed downhill along an unlit road between Coventry and Leamington, dodging potholes. Cars rushed past in both directions, and suddenly my brand new light fell off. I couldn't see a thing. I was going fast, unable to stop, and I had no idea where the verge was or where the next pothole was. If I hit something and slid off my bike, I wasn't sure that the car behind me would stop in time. I was in total darkness and in danger of my lights going out forever. Now in 600 BC, Isaiah the prophet cried out that humanity is in perilous danger of hurtling into the darkness. And in John's Gospel, Jesus twice claimed to be the solution by saying, I am the light of the world. And for those of us who receive his light, we have a daring role to play. So, walking in darkness. Isaiah, a prophet whose words are recorded in the Old Testament, that's the section of the Bible that was written before Jesus walked this earth. He made a concise assessment of the human condition. He wrote this: humanity, they will see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. In other words, Isaiah claims that we are born spiritually and morally blind, in the dark, unable to discern between illusion and reality, unable to navigate our way through life safely, unable to guarantee avoiding or contributing towards despair, suffering, evil, and injustice. And we're hurtling through life, unable to stop, Isaiah says. But Isaiah also prophesied that one would come into the world and illuminate the darkness. He said, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us, a child has been born. Now fast forward 600 years from Isaiah's writing, and we find Jesus and his disciples walking around at a festival in Jerusalem. And this was the Festival of Tabernacles. It was a celebration of God rescuing his people, Israel, from slavery in Egypt. It was only a few weeks ago that we were reading about that. Do you remember? In Exodus, Pharaoh, the plagues, the walking through the wilderness, the pillar of light. Do you remember? So many candles were lit at this festival that people could see as they wandered around Jerusalem, which was quite a novelty because at night there were no streetlights. The candles reminded them of God in the pillar of light that guided and protected his people in the wilderness. It was a celebration. And just as all the candles were going to be extinguished at the end of this festival, plunging the city back into darkness, Jesus took that moment to exclaim, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now that is a claim of cosmic significance. A claim of cosmic significance. That is a claim stating that Jesus is the one that Isaiah was talking about. The one and only who could rescue humanity from darkness. The darkness of despair and evil and suffering and injustice. When Jesus made that bold claim the first time in John chapter 8, The religious experts, the Pharisees, essentially said, yeah, right, prove it. Fair enough. And Jesus takes on that challenge to prove it by taking on a form of darkness that no one has ever overcome, that of being born blind. So let's hear, as Ellen reads chapter 9, how that challenge unfolds.
All right, we're on page 1085 if you've got one of our church Bibles. John chapter 9. As he went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it onto the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed, and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" They were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered. "We know he was born blind, but how can he see now? Or who opened his eyes? We don't know. Ask him. He is of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. This was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God," they whispered. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, You are this fellow's disciples. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as far as this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains."
That's quite a story. Jesus smashed it. When someone says, "I am the light of the world," it's hard not to take them seriously when they open the eyes of a man born blind. So let's take a look, first of all, at the Pharisees who were divided, and then at the man born blind who stood tall. Lunatic, liar, or light of the world. The claim and the miracle caused deep division. It did then, and it still does today. Many say Jesus is simply a good man, but this can't be, because Jesus claimed to be God. So he's either a lunatic, a liar, or the light of the world. In verse 16 it says, "Some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.'" They were offended because Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, and their man-made laws forbade that. So they thought, he's a liar. But verse 16 continues. Others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" Well, that's a good point. How could someone open the eyes of the blind and perform so many other miracles if they were simply a lunatic or a liar? And so, verse 16 concludes, they were divided. Now, last year, I've shared this story before, I helped a friend move house, and as we were throwing boxes into the van, he went over his ankle really badly. And I said, "Would you mind if I prayed for your ankle?" And he said, "I'd love that." So I prayed for his ankle, and he kind of got on okay through the day. And I thought, okay, we've done all right. That was on a Friday. Tuesday night, I was at sports training. I trained with him. He's a sports friend. He came bounding up to me, and he said, "Tim, my ankle's been miraculously healed. I've got so many questions." And as we started jogging around the pitch, he said, "I suppose it doesn't really matter who you think God is, so long as you have faith." And I said, "Well, actually, it comes down to who you think Jesus is. Every religion will have their own answer to that question. But it comes down to whether you think Jesus is mad, bad, or the Son of God. Liar, lunatic, or light of the world." A few days later, we caught up again, and he said, "Jehovah's Witnesses were knocking on my door, and they asked me, 'Who do I think Jesus is?' And I said, 'God.' They said, 'Why do you think that?' And he said, 'Well, he can't be mad or bad, so he must be God.'" Jesus' claim to be the light of the world is an exclusive claim. It's a claim to be the one and only who is able to overcome all the darkness in us and around us. And before preparing for this talk, I'd never noticed how many times John, who writes this gospel, uses the phrase, "the one and only," to describe Jesus. 5 times. Let me read you each of those 5 verses. John 1:14, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." John 1:18, "No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known." John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son." John 3:18, "Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. And finally, 1 John 4:9, so a letter that John wrote. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. The one and only, an exclusive claim. I and I alone, Jesus says, am the light of the world. And that's offensive. Whatever insights other religions or faiths may bring us, Jesus claims that he alone can bring us to God. And that claim causes offense. It causes division. Lunatic, liar, or light of the world? What do you say? For me, the empty tomb is such a compelling case for Jesus truly being the light of the world. If he died and rose again, he defeated not just blindness, the darkness of blindness, but the darkness of death itself. He said he would die and rise again. And after he was crucified on a cross, his body was placed in a tomb with Roman guards and a huge rock, and yet his body went missing. Some say Jesus may not have quite died on the cross, but the Romans knew how to execute someone. And even if he hadn't quite died and he'd regained his consciousness in the tomb, he still, having been tortured on a cross, had to push a huge rock to one side and get past armed guards. The 12 disciples were accused of having stolen Jesus' body to keep up the pretense that Jesus was God. But almost all of them were martyred. Would they really lie at the cost of their own lives? Perhaps grave robbers took the body. But how did they get past the Roman guards, and why would they leave the only things of value, Jesus' clothes that were not folded neatly? Would grave robbers take the time to fold his clothes? Why would they strip his body in the first place before running off with it? That's a bit weird. And then 500 witnesses claimed to see Jesus alive again, which is recorded in the Gospels. And the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were desperate to kill this rumor that Jesus might have come back to life, that he really might have been the light of the world. They were desperately searching for his body, but they could not find it. It was only a few years ago that King Richard III's body turned up under a car park in Leicester, and yet we still haven't found Jesus' body. For me, that is compelling evidence that Jesus really is the light of the world. The one and only who overcomes despair, suffering, evil, and injustice, and death. Lunatic, liar, or light of the world? Who do you say Jesus is? Well, let's move on to the man born blind, as he stood tall for Jesus. It's not unreasonable that Jesus' exclusive claim would stir up such objection, such emotion, such cynicism. But just look at how this man stands tall for Jesus. First of all, his conviction grows as we read through the passage. In verse 11, he tells his neighbors, the man they call Jesus did it. In verse 17, he says to the Pharisees, when they ask him who he thinks Jesus is, he says, a prophet. So he's gone from just a man to a prophet. And then by the end, in verse 38, when Jesus asks him if he believes in the Son of Man, in other words, if he believes in God's rescuer of humanity, he responds, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. And in this story, he delivers a brilliantly simple and courageous testimony, doesn't he? As the Pharisees refuse to believe his story, bringing him in a second time, cross-examining him, they've asked his parents, they've got him back in. He says in verse 25, one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. It's hard to argue with that. If you've discovered Jesus as the light of the world, the one and only who overcomes despair and suffering and evil and injustice. Will you stand tall for him? Will you help others explore his claim to be the light of the world? Jesus said to his disciples at the start of this story in verse 4, "As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work." In other words, there is some urgency to people discovering this claim of Jesus because they're hurtling towards darkness, and we have a daring role to play. Jesus says, as long as it's day, in other words, time is running out, we, not I, not just Jesus, not just the blind man, but we must do the works of him who sent me. We don't need to be articulate or well-educated. Each of us has a simple testimony of Jesus working in our lives that is hard to argue with. Will you stand tall for Jesus? Jesus, lunatic, liar, or light of the world? Us. Will we stand tall for Jesus?